So the purpose of this screencast is to get you caught up to the section that we were working on before we left for spring break on competition. We had a series of questions that this section of material was going to be basically addressing, essentially defining what competition is, what the different types of competition are in terms of who's competing, types of competition are in terms of how the competitive contest is fought, the types of things that can be competed for, and how differences in the competitors and differences in the characteristics of the things being competed for affect competition. We talked about competition being a situation where two individuals, whether it's two individuals within the same species or two individuals in different species, are competing for a limiting resource. We talked about the difference between interspecific versus intraspecific competition in terms of who's doing the competing. We also talked about exploitative versus interference competition in terms of how the competitive contest is fought. We talked briefly about the kinds of things that can be competed for, and we also talked about how differences in the competitors and differences in the things being competed over will affect competition. So, for example, spatially clumped resources are going to tend to be competed for in an interference sort of way because the resource is localized, and as a result, that resource can be defended, whereas resources that are more broadly distributed are going to be prone to exploitative competition because it's almost impossible to control access to these widely dispersed resources. We also talked about a couple of different conceptual lenses through which you can view competition. We talked about game theory versus optimality theory, and we talked in particular about the ideal free distribution. And we've talked about the ideal free distribution in the past, so I went into talking about game theory. We talked about the prisoner's dilemma. This is why cops separate prisoners into two different interview rooms when they're expected to have been collaborating on the commission of a crime, because it's much easier to get them to defect when they don't know what the other prisoner is saying. We talked about the assumptions that underlie game theory. If the players don't fit those assumptions, then the game theoretical model that you've created won't do a very good job of predicting behavior. As we've discussed before, anytime you get the assumptions that are underlying a behavioral interaction, chances are you're not going to be able to predict behavior very well. So we talked about what an evolutionarily stable strategy is. It's a strategy that, if adopted by all members of the population, can't be invaded by an alternative strategy. And this is pretty much where we left off, and I was about to introduce you to the hawk-dove game, which is laid out in your textbook in Chapter 5. So this is the table from your textbook, and it basically defines what has come to be known as the hawk-dove game. And don't think of hawks and doves as two different species. Think of hawk and dove as two different tactics that individuals within a population can play. So imagine that you have a population of hawks and doves, a population of humans rather, and some individuals are going to adopt the tactic of being a hawk. Other individuals are going to adopt the tactic of being a dove. And so we can create a payoff matrix, and you can see the payoff matrix down here. And these up here is where the assumptions are. So I'm going to get a pen. Or maybe I'll just get a laser. Oh, yeah, I'll get a green laser. Going back. So up here, it basically says that when the winner gains, it gains 50 of whatever it is that there is to gain. When a loser loses, they gain nothing. But when the winner when a hawk engages in a contest, it loses 100 of whatever it is due to injuries. And the assumptions are when a hawk meets a hawk, on half the occasions it will win, on half the occasions it suffers an injury. And these two things are independent of one another. You might win, and I worked through this in class, how you might win and suffer no injury and you get the full 50. You might lose and incur an injury and lose 100. And so this ends up being an average cost based on these assumptions. So any average hawk will win half the time and get the full 50, and it will incur injury half the time and be docked 100 of whatever the reward is. On the other hand, when hawks meet doves, the dove always backs down, and so the hawk gets the full benefit of winning and also incurs no injury cost because there essentially isn't an interaction. When a dove attacks a hawk, once again, it doesn't gain anything, but it also doesn't lose anything because when it comes up against hawk, it basically retreats. And then when doves meet doves, they basically agree to share, which means they get half of the benefit. And so this isn't a pure, neither of these tactics result in a pure ESS because a population made up of all hawks, everybody in that population has a reward that is minus 25. So any dove coming in would have a gain of plus 25, and doves would be able to infiltrate a population of hawks. In the same way, a population of doves, a single hawk coming into that population would then gain 50, and so it would push the equilibrium towards more and more hawks. So because this isn't a pure ESS, an ESS that can't be invaded by another strategy, it ends up being what we call a mixed ESS. And in a mixed ESS, the challenge is, well, how do you figure out what the ratio of individuals playing hawk versus individuals playing dove should be? So to do this, you have to do a little math. And since this is something that I would normally write up on the board, I've decided to just write this on a piece of paper and take you through the process as if we were in class. So the hawk-dove game is not a pure ESS. In a population of nothing but hawks, doves can invade. In a population of nothing but doves, hawks can invade. So in a mixed ESS, the two strategies or tactics will exist at an equilibrium. We can calculate the proportion of hawks and the proportion of doves at equilibrium by setting the payoffs to hawks equal to the payoffs to doves. That's kind of how you normally figure out equilibrium, by taking these two strategies and setting them equal to one another, where you get the same reward as a hawk that you do as a dove. That's where the equilibrium values will lie. So the proportion of hawks here is H. The proportion of doves is 1 minus H, because there are only two particular tactics or strategies in this game. So the average payoff to a hawk strategy is minus 25 plus 50. This is when it goes up against hawks. This is when it goes up against doves. And the rate at which you achieve these two things is dependent upon the proportion of hawks to the proportion of doves. And the same thing is true of the dove strategy. It gets 0 when it goes up against hawks, and it gets 25 when it goes up against other doves. And so the degree to which they get 0 versus 25 is dependent upon how many hawks are in the population and how many doves are in the population. So we set these two things equal to one another, and then we're going to basically be solving for the proportion of hawks, solving for H. So we can take this equation and basically multiply out the things that are separated by parentheses. So we have minus 25 plus 50 minus 50h, and 25 minus 25h, because this is 0h and essentially the 0, so we're just expanding this out. Once we have that done, we can combine terms on this side, and then we start doing some addition. We add 75 to this side. It gets rid of h on this side of the equation, moves it to this side of the equation, which leaves us with 50 equals 25 plus 50h. Subtract 25 from both sides. We get 25 equals 50h, and then divide by 50 to isolate h. And it gives us half the population should be hawks, which means that half the population should be doves. Now, in this case, it doesn't have to mean that you have a polymorphism in the population such that some individuals always play hawk and some individuals always play dove, and there's a 50-50 mix of those individuals. It could be that individuals in the population are capable of employing either hawk or dove in any given interaction, but if these are the parameters of the payoff matrix, half of the time you should play hawk and half of the time you should play dove, and that should result in both strategies or tactics achieving the same level of reward. So this is how game theory operates. And one of the nice things about game theory is it makes very specific predictions about, for example, what the relative proportions of different tactics should be in a population under a specific set of conditions. So that was a non-iterative game. That's a game where each individual comes up against another individual only once, and then they go away and they never see one another. But you can also look at game theory where the games are iterative, where individuals will meet one another over and over again. And Robert Axelrod in 1982 did this in an iterative game, and he basically figured out that the optimal strategy is just to do whatever the last individual did to you. And so in the behavior, if you come up to, if you're in a hawk-dove game and it's an iterative game, and an individual comes up to you and plays dove, you should play dove. And then the next individual that you interact with, you should also, play the last strategy that was played towards you. If in that second interaction you're playing dove and the other individual plays hawk, then in the next iteration of the game you should play hawk, and so it becomes more of a response that is conditioned on your prior experience rather than a strict ratio that is set. So that's how game theory kind of operates. We've talked about the ideal free distribution, but we haven't talked about it in a great deal of detail. And so at this point, I want to go through and talk about the ideal free distribution because it's a classic sort of exploitative competition model. So imagine that you have two habitats, a rich and a poor habitat. Individuals can choose freely which habitat to exploit. And once again, this is the kind of environment that you find when you go to the grocery store before the coronavirus came along. You have a selection of checkout counters that you can go to, and you can choose freely which one you're going to get into. And of course, everybody is trying to minimize the amount of time that they spend in line. And the idea of ideal free distribution is that if everybody's trying to minimize the amount of time that they spend in line, they will distribute themselves across the different lanes in a way that everybody spends the same amount of time in the lane. So imagine that you have a rich habitat and you have a poor habitat. And in these two habitats, these are the rewards per individual. The more individuals that are in that habitat, the rewards go down because you are dividing that limited resource across a larger number of individuals, and competitors can come into this environment. Well, clearly the first individual has an environment that is free of other individuals, and so it should certainly go into the first, it should be the first competitor in the rich environment. This horizontal line here is drawing a line from the top of the poor environment's curve to where that intersects with the rich environment. We'll see why that's there here in a minute. So if there's already an individual there, the second individual has to decide, do I go to the rich environment or do I go to the poor environment? Well, it should go to the rich environment because it's going to achieve greater rewards in the rich environment than in the poor environment. The same is true of the third individual, the fourth individual, the fifth individual, the sixth individual, the seventh individual, the eighth individual, and the ninth individual. Now the question is, where should the 10th individual go? Should the 10th individual go to the rich environment or should it go to the poor environment? Well, that's all dependent upon what the rewards for the 10th individual are going to be. The rewards for the 10th individual fall below this line, and so the 10th individual should actually go to the poor environment. Same thing for the 11th individual, should go to the poor environment. The 12th individual should go to the poor environment. Watch how this line is coming down to meet whether it should be the 10th individual in the rich environment or the 13th individual, or the 4th individual rather, in the poor environment. Well, when we get to that individual, the reward in the poor environment is below what the reward would be in the rich environment. So the 13th individual will go into the rich environment, and chances are the 14th individual will also go into the rich environment, and it'll take another couple of individuals before you get another individual coming into the poor environment. So what you should see over time is that the number of individuals will be distributed in an ideal free way between the two environments based upon what the reward is. And in all these cases, you can see that the 13th individual in the rich environment is not really getting many more rewards than what will be the fourth individual in the poor environment. And it's not getting many fewer rewards than the third individual in the poor environment. And so in this way, the ideal free distribution works out such that individuals are distributing themselves among the different patches, if you would have, in a way that gives everybody approximately the same reward. So there's the 14th individual and the 15th individual, etc., etc., etc. So the assumptions are that individuals are free to move around, there's no interference competition, and individuals possess complete information. And so when we've seen experimental tests of this, you can see that when you change the feeding rate, for example, at different ends of the tank, that fish respond relatively quickly to that change, such that they distribute themselves in a way that is predicted pretty well by ideal free distribution. This is once again these kinds of tests that I've described in class before. If we look at the feeding experiment with a flock of 33 mallards, food was thrown in upon it twice the rate at site A compared to site B, and what you see is the number of ducks at site A, and then when you shifted the distribution of food, you see that they shift away from site A and they go to site B. And so the profitability of the different sites is what is determining the distribution of ducks and fish in this case. We can also think of this in terms of our old friends, the dung flies. When we talked about dung flies, remember that fresh dung pats are the types of dung pats that are most useful to the females for egg laying. You can see that this is a dung pat that is partially dried out. You can see the dried out section here in the lower part of this picture. And what happens is, as the dung pat dries out, the number of males that are hanging out on that dung pat waiting for females to come and arrive and lay eggs goes down over time because the quality of the patch is declining over time. And it's not declining because of the number of males, it's declining because of the quality of the patch. As the patch quality declines over time, i.e. the dung pat is drying up, the number of males waiting for females on that dung pat declines. But the result of that is that at any given time, the male mating success stays relatively constant, because when there are a lot of males when a dung pat is fresh, they're also sharing a large number of females because the females are attracted to the fresh cow patty. As the pat dries out, you have fewer and fewer males, but you also have fewer and fewer females because patch quality is declining, such that everybody has the same mating success. This is exactly what the ideal free distribution would predict. Now, when you're just talking about things like the numbers of fish at different ends of a tank, here we have two ends of a tank. Here's an end where there's getting twice as much food as this end is. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 food particles coming out versus 3. Well, you have different numbers of fish here. You have 12 fish, 6 fish here, 6 fish here. These fish are all half the size of this fish. So in that case, we can have 6 fish on this side and 6 fish on this side, and that's an ideal free distribution because you have twice as much food on this side. The kind of equations that the kind of solutions that we originally talked about was having 12 fish that are all of equal size. Well, you should have twice as many over here as there are over here because they're all the same size. You should have 8 fish here and 4 fish here. But if the fish are different sizes, you could distribute them this way. But if you took one of these fish that are larger and moved it to this side, 2 of these fish would move to the other side. So you can also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, excuse me, 7 fish on one side and 5 fish on another, and that would be an ideal free distribution because the same biomass is on the biomass is divided up in an ideal free way. If we took a second fish that is large from this side and moved it to this side, then two of the fish from this side would move over to this side. So we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 1, 2, 3, 4. This looks like this, but it's that same ratio of fish for a totally different reason. And so there are multiple ways of getting ideal free distribution depending on the biomass distribution if the competitors are, for example, different sizes and they're attempting to maximize the amount of energy gain. So you can also look at ideal free distribution in bugs that occur on plants. As leaves get larger, the reproductive success of the female gets bigger. So you can see leaf size is 18.9 centimeters squared, 16.6, down to 8.8. As you go from large leaf sizes to small leaf sizes, the total reproductive capacity of the female goes down because presumably these involve patches of different sizes, of different qualities. But then as they get competed for, if you're the first female in a given patch, you achieve higher reproductive success than if you're the second or the third. And some leaf sizes are small enough that they only support 2 females. So on a large plant, you get 180 offspring versus about 145 offspring versus about 110 offspring, depending on whether you're the first female, the second female, or whether you're on the leaf alone or whether you're sharing it with 3 other females. But another thing happens in that the position on the leaf also affects things, such that if you're located down here at the base of the leaf, that base of the leaf position is better because all of the products going to the leaf and coming from the leaf go through the primary vein here at the beginning, and so they actually compete in an interference way for positioning on the plant. But once again, you can assume that plant bugs will distribute themselves among the various patches in a way that they all achieve approximately the same reproductive output. Now, this is a very different situation than the situation that arises when you have the capacity to defend an environment. So in this case, there's some interference competition going on here, and that a female located at the base might be able to prevent other individuals from getting onto her leaf. And so when resources are aggregated, they're spatially clumped, it's pretty easy to defend those resources, and as a result, they'll do so to the degree to which they can. So in a rich habitat, you might add numbers of competitors up to some point at which that resource is saturated, in which case those individuals in the rich habitat will basically repel any competitors coming in, and then those other competitors will have to go to the poor habitat until that poor habitat is full at a level that is lower than the level that the rich habitat can support. And then after that, any individuals that are trying to enter this area where these 2 habitats occur will just not be able to get any of whatever the resource is. And so this is where interference competition begins to take a foothold. So as we think about defending territories, we have to think about both the benefits. So the dark line here and the red line here represent diminishing returns curves, such that as you get larger and larger territories, your rewards get higher and higher, but once again, they get higher at a decreasing rate. But also, as you're defending territories, larger territories are harder to defend than smaller territories. And there comes a point where, as the cost of territory defense rises, you get a point where it just is no longer economically beneficial to defend that territory anymore. And this is why we have this shift from exploitative competition to interference competition. Exploitation should occur where the cost of resource defense is higher than the benefits, and interference should occur where the cost of defense is lower than the benefit that you get. And you can make predictions about what the optimal territory size is depending on the shape of the cost curve and the shape of the gain curve for rich and poor territories. So if you live in a place where there are rich territories, the difference between what you're doing is you're maximizing the difference between the benefit and the cost. And that maximization occurs at a lower territory size in rich territories and a larger territory size in poor territories. And so in a poor territory, you're going to be maintaining a larger territory. That territory is going to give you less energy overall, but you're also going to be incurring higher costs for that territory, as opposed to a rich territory that gives you more energy to begin with, but you're expending more energy and or time to maintain that territory. So once again, the net benefit gain here is higher for rich territories than poor territories. And once again, at this point, it no longer is beneficial to maintain a territory. And it doesn't really matter what the shapes of these curves are, the same thing still occurs. But it might affect what the equilibrium territory size is, depending on the shape of these, whether they're diminishing returns curves or they're linear curves up to some threshold. So we can look at birds defending territories along a stream. When the renewal rate of the territory is high, the birds will shift from interference competition, which is down here, to exploitative competition, where they're sharing a resource and not interfering with one another. And when renewal rates are relatively low, they will actually be impeding the other individual's ability to gain access to that. And so once again, the line is the theoretical prediction for where you should shift, and you see that the data fall out pretty well in terms of whether you should be exhibiting resource defense strategies versus exploitative strategies. Your book also talks about the differences between producers versus scroungers. Producers are individuals in an environment that tend to make prey more available, and scroungers are individuals that tend to basically steal the food, in this case, that scroungers make available. I think about this when I go to tilt my garden, or when I go to mow my yard. As I'm tilling actually, or as I'm mowing my yard, one of the things that I notice is that all the birds in the area come down and hang out around me. And it's because as I'm tilling, I'm digging up not only the soil, but I'm digging up insects. And they come and they dig through the freshly tilled soil and get access to these insects that weren't available to them before. And the same thing happens when I'm mowing. As soon as I cut the grass down lower, it makes the prey that are down in there, oftentimes these are crickets that live in my yard, and it makes them easier to find by birds, and so they will once again fly around me as I'm mowing to get the prey that are now more visible. And so one thing that can happen in a producer-scrounger system is that the producer gets more food than the scrounger regardless, and because the scroungers are poorer competitors, they also have lower fitness across a range of proportion of scroungers on the x-axis here. So the x-axis is the proportion of scroungers, and then the y-axis is the fitness of both producers and scroungers. So one way to maintain both of them in the population is that individuals who are producers have higher fitness, and individuals who are scroungers have lower fitness, but they benefit from the presence of the producers. But there can also be a situation where being a scrounger is actually more beneficial when there are relatively few scroungers. Producers don't have a change. This is the same curve on this figure as in this figure. Producers have the same fitness curve because they're producers, but when scroungers are rare, they may actually get more benefit from the producers because there's actually just less competition for food altogether. But as scroungers get more and more abundant, the advantages of being a scrounger are lower because the producers are producing the same amount of food, but now there are more scroungers competing for it. And so once again, there's an equilibrium point here where the fitness of producers and the fitness of scroungers crosses that basically sets what an equilibrium proportion of scroungers should be. And so just like all models, this has been tested in the lab. This is a situation where they tested this in enclosures full of birds, where they have a barrier, and on one side there's scrounger, on the other side are producers. The producers sit on these perches and they pull levers that basically produce food, and they produce food for themselves, and they produce food for the scroungers. And then when they tested this with uncovered food versus covered food, they found that, once again, the line for the producers, which is the solid line, is such that there's not really a difference in their fitness for uncovered versus covered, but the fitness curve for, in this case, the feeding rate curve for scroungers was different, such that the equilibrium number of scroungers where the food is uncovered is at about between 2 and 3 scroungers, and the equilibrium number for scroungers where food is covered is 1. In the covered situation, the scroungers are more dependent upon the producers for producing the food because the food is covered. And so once again, we see the number of individuals playing the scrounger strategy is low under conditions of covered food, and it increases when the food is uncovered, when they did this over a period of days. So we've been talking about strategies and tactics, and I've been using these terms kind of interchangeably, but if we're going to be more rigorous about this, a strategy can be defined as a genetically based decision rule, or differences between strategies are due to differences in genes. Now, strategies can be conditional on the conditions that you find an individual in this, but strategies can be conditional depending upon the conditions an individual finds themselves in. A tactic, on the other hand, is a behavior played as part of a strategy. So a strategy could be to play hawk at one time and dove at another time, and each of those two things is a tactic within this overall strategy that is hawk-dove, and you can play either of those particular parts. The strategy might be genetically encoded, but the tactic that you are employing at any given moment is an outgrowth of that genetically encoded strategy. It's a subtle distinction, but possibly an important distinction. So a strategy might be to fight above threshold X, sneak below threshold X, and the tactics are fight and sneak, but the strategy is you do one thing under one condition and you do another thing under another condition. And so this is kind of the difference. We think about this strategy of sneaking sometimes when we think of mating in a neuron, frog and toad populations. What oftentimes happens when toads and frogs aggregate at a pond is you will have frogs or toads that are calling, and then right next to them or nearby there will be a toad that is not calling. Now, one of the difficulties of calling for attracting a mate is that calling requires a lot of energy, and so a sneaker male, a satellite male, can hang out near a male that is calling. The male that is calling is essentially a producer. It's producing females, and this guy is a scrounger or a satellite or a sneaker, and he grabs females as they're making their way to the calling male's call. Now, when an individual is really loud, they're doing a really good job of calling females over, and there's no incentive for the satellite male to do any calling. He saves energy, and just intercepts females coming to the male that is calling. But as the intensity of the subject's call goes down, the neighbor's call is louder relative to that, and they tend to shift from being satellite males to being calling males. And so whenever the subject, the focal male, is really loud, the tendency is for individuals to be satellite males and sneak matings. Similar thing happens in dung beetles. I don't know why organisms that aggregate around dung are so popular among behavioral ecologists, except that maybe they're focal and know that they're going to be there because there's a dung pad there. So what happens in dung beetles is the females arrive at the dung, the males battle for access to the females, the female will then go down into the ground and lay her eggs, but the guarding male can be basically hoodwinked because a sneaking male can then dig a tunnel down and mate with the female as well. And whether you are a sneaking male versus a guard male has everything to do with whether or not you have gigantic horns on your body or not. And these horns are actually outgrowths of the thorax. And so you can look at how body size is correlated with horn length. And body size in this case is normally distributed, but horn length is bimodal, such that you have some individuals in the population with really large horns and some individuals in the population with really small horns. And what you see happening is that if you have small horns, you adopt a tactic of sneaking. If you have large horns, you compete for access to the dung pile and you guard that dung pile, and the sneaking males have the possibility to come around and sneak. And whether you adopt one strategy, the sneaker male or the guarding male, is all dependent upon what your phenotype is. And once again, your book talks about how to figure out equilibrium levels for which strategy is going to be represented more within a given population. Sometimes these strategies are quite complicated. This is a system that has been worked out in the desert southwest of the United States, where you have these side blotched lizards. And there's a polymorphism in the population such that you have orange, blue, and yellow-throated morphs. And when these morphs come into contact with one another, the competitive outcome is kind of like a rock, paper, scissors game. And that's the analogy that Barry Sinervo has used to describe this system. And in competitive interactions, and these are males coming together, displaying at one another, and then figuring out which male is going to back down first. And what this person has basically shown is that the frequency of particular throat colors in a population determines who wins. And so orange wins in populations where there is a high proportion of blue. Yellow wins in populations where there is a high proportion of orange, and blue wins when there is a high proportion of yellow. And so each of these has a particular utility dependent upon which of these other strategies is being employed. And so basically orange beats blue, yellow beats orange, and blue beats yellow. And so this whole thing is a frequency-dependent selection system that maintains this polymorphism in competitive interactions, such that you can have all three of these being found in the same population, but depending on what the local male morph frequency is, the outcome of competition is depending upon essentially which morph is the rarest in this case. And that is it for competition. So we'll talk about this on Monday, and hopefully you will have read the chapter and viewed the screencast before Monday arrives. Thanks for listening.